Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to another review. This time I'm going to be talking about The Fox and the Hound 2. As my more dedicated viewers will know, I recently watched for the very first time The Fox and the Hound from 1981, and now I'm going to review its sequel from 2006, or perhaps its midquel would be more appropriate, from 2006, which I also watched for the very first time. I think while Disney movies as a whole are very permeated in the public consciousness, the Disney sequels are more generational, specific to specific generations in a way, and also specific to specific people. They're very mixed in terms of quality. Well, I'll just be honest. We all know the reputation the direct-to-video Disney sequels have. They do not have a good reputation. Most of them are not very good. And I'm sad to say that The Fox and the Hound 2 was a film which I did not enjoy. I found it to be devoid of any deeper meaning or anything like that. I found it to be just the definition of a filler movie to exist with no real purpose, and it was, I knew what I was getting into when I watched it, and I was still bored and disappointed. Quite frankly, with the plot being as thin as it is, I'm shocked they managed to stretch this out to the runtime that it has. So one thing, and let me give some contextual evidence for this. Something which I didn't touch upon in my original Fox and the Hound review was the sort of parallels between, well, not parallels, but the overall concept and theme of becoming friends with someone despite what society at large may think of it, or alternatively, the broader idea of just growing apart from someone over time and how that can affect someone. And, you know, you can read the film whichever way you want. I think most people would agree that the sort of race relations commentary is the most common, deeper reading of what that film is trying to convey. And while I didn't touch upon it in my review just because people mention it so often, I'm more focused on the technical aspects. I do want to say that was something which did not go over my head. And so, in this film, which takes place during the main characters of the first film's childhood, Todd and Copper, the fox and the hound, this was when they were still young, they were still friends, they hadn't grown up yet, and so they weren't yet enemies. They were still thinking that they would be friends forever. And because of this, a lot of people are going to say that this was a bad idea because inherently it's sort of limiting. You can't really explore the same things as the second film did. I mean, the first film did. This is the second film. It's confusing because of the timeline. Anyway, and to people who have that feeling, I can understand where you're coming from, but people who know this channel know that I am a bit of a creative at heart, and I don't think this premise is inherently bad. I think if someone were to approach me and say, we're doing a sequel to Fox and the Hound so that we can make money, we're gonna set it during the main character's childhood so that way we can still have them be together and make a sort of inconsequential storyline out of it. I would say, if I was like the writer or whatever for this, I'd say, okay, give me a bit of time, I'll try and make something out of this that reflects the original in some way or form. And I think the two major obstacles here are, well, one is the inherent problem with prequels, or in this case, midquels, I guess, which is something I feel like only Disney does, which is that you're kind of constrained in where you can take the story and where you can go, because you know where you need to end things. With that said, I think the main problems with this film aren't because it's a midquel, but just because they do not reflect the original film at all. And when it comes to reviewing kids' media, I think something I want to emphasize isn't that I'm disappointed in stuff for not meeting the standards of adult entertainment. That's not what I'm looking for when I'm looking at kids' entertainment. Although I would very much like it to go above and beyond. But what I'm looking for, and often what I'm comparing it to, is other works of entertainment within its same grouping. For instance, when I reviewed Lunatics Unleashed, I wasn't comparing it to today's TV shows or even today's cartoons that kids would watch today. I compared it to other action shows of that time, and compared to other action shows of that time, I felt it was severely lacking in the character department and in character relationships. Now, with The Fox and the Hound, this is a bit of a different story because it is a sequel. And when you do a sequel, you do have a certain responsibility to maintain a consistency with the first film. This is a follow-up after all. And I think that this movie fails in a couple of accounts. First off, on a more basic level, tonally speaking, this is a much more cartoonish movie than the first, which is going to be weird to say considering this is an animated film. But I think one aspect which I don't see talked about is how the original Fox and the Hound was fairly grounded. You know, you had your talking animals, but they never really went overboard in how cartoony things got, for lack of a better term, and how goofy things would get. With this, they play it much more fast and loose. They go over the top time and time again. They have a whole, they'll have scenes where there's like chases around the farm and the characters will like stop and watch because how ridiculous it is. And they had like a sequence where, the Ferris wheel gets blown off its axis and is rolling around the fair, and it's like they get really over the top with it, and it clashes so much with the fairly restrained approach that the first movie had. And the first movie needed that restrained approach because while it did have comedic relief scenes, which I went over and wasn't a big fan of, at the same time it was trying to tell a more serious story as far as Disney films go. With this, however, and don't get me wrong, this is telling a more lighthearted story, and I don't think that's inherently a crime to tell a more lighthearted story after, what we know there, what it's leading up to. But at the same time, there is a limit to how far you can take it, and I just think there wasn't enough restraint shown on the part of the creators in that aspect. Now, the second problem I have is that this really ignores the greater theme of The Fox and the Hound, which was established in the first film. And again, if someone's watching this and thinking this person is taking a kid's movie way too seriously, I am holding it to the standards of like some masterful adult entertainment out there. All I'm doing is looking at what the first film did and saying, does this movie, which is a sequel to the first, hold to the same standards as that first film? Which is something I would do no matter what, because that's just fair. So, as I said earlier, the major theme, or a major theme, of the first Fox and the Hound was sort of this race relations angle, which, it doesn't have to explicitly be race relations, but the aspect of it where the Fox and the Hound grow apart, not through their own volition, but just because of the greater societal and systemic strings pulling them around. And this film, I can understand the thought process for kind of ignoring that, but at the same time, it doesn't make any sense for everyone to ignore that part. Because let me give some context. So the whole storyline for this is that a fair comes into town, and Copper, the dog, becomes a part of this singing dog group. And then that creates like a friendship tension or whatever, and that's the entire storyline, basically. There isn't much more to it than that. I literally don't think I can give more to it than that. there's a lot of scenes which just drag on, and the whole thing feels dragged on. It's not even an hour and a half. It's like just over an hour, and it feels so stretched and so thin. And when you have a lighter story like that, which is a bizarre story to go with, but, you know, whatever. When you have a lighter story like that, I think you don't need to go into as extreme lengths to explore the theme of the first film as the first film did. But I think the writers still could have explored it in some way, because an interesting thing I noticed about this is that Todd, the fox, is kind of an outsider in terms of being a fox. He's surrounded by dogs constantly, and there's even a cat in this movie, and yet there's never a moment where they really explore the psychological aspect of that, of someone who hangs out with a group of people which are different from them in some way, and they can make friends with those people, but at the same time, when they're sort of alone and isolated, there can be a tension in a way. Not really a tension, but like, I don't think there should be a tension between Copper and Todd, because they're just children. They're meant to be innocent. That's what they represent, is that innocence before society comes in and messes them up. But there are a lot of older dogs in this, and it's never something which is really addressed. And the only reason I'm going into this is because it was a very easy avenue that they could have taken in order to carry on what the first film had established, thematically speaking, to make that link. And without it, the whole film feels totally void and hollow, thematically speaking. There isn't any depth to it. It's really just more entertainment to entertain the kids, then that's it. And I don't want to say there was no effort put into the film. I think the animation is quite nice. I know that obviously, you know, straight-to-video animation isn't going to be as good as theatrically released animation, but this was fairly nice animation, I felt. I think that's a strong aspect to the film, is that it does look nice. This is the sort of 2D animation which we don't see that much anymore, although I will say it is marred by a lot of 3D effects that they throw in, which they probably could have done a better job with. I don't think they did a very good job integrating 3D into the 2D. The only time I really saw 3D well integrated was something like Futurama. I think that did a pretty good job at integrating its 3D models, but here it just looks jarring and it doesn't look good. Another problem I have with it is that for some reason characters that were around in the first film just do not appear in this film. Like Big Mama, the owl, who was a pretty significant part of the first film, isn't even mentioned or doesn't even make a cameo. She's just not there, which is really weird because she was often like a guiding adult that would, you know, look over Todd in a way. And so it's weird that she isn't here to give any advice. But yeah, that was my thoughts on The Fox and the Hound 2. I don't think it's a good film. And again, I know I said it like 3 times already, but I'm only holding this film to the standards which were established in the film which preceded it, which is not an unreasonable thing to do, and I feel like it really let down. It was a real letdown in that aspect. So yeah, that's my thoughts on The Fox and the Hound 2. I'd be very curious to hear what it was like growing up with this film, if anyone in the comments section did. If you've watched it, then feel free to leave a comment about it down below. I'd really love to hear what you think. Maybe you have a bigger thematic insight into this film than I do, and you are like, no, there's a great subtext here. And I'm not saying you need deep thematic stuff or deep subtext to make a great film. I'm just saying the first film established this stuff, and this film just drops everything for a filler episode, you know what I mean? So, yeah, I guess the one benefit is that it gives us a bit more context to Todd and Copper's relationship, which wasn't delved that much into in the first film, because, again, with the first film, I said there were too many comedy scenes, which could have been dedicated to the character relationships. Anyway, I'm in a spiral here. I'm in a perpetual loop. So I'll let you go now. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like or dislike, and I would be very happy if you could subscribe in order to get, stay up to date on all my future videos and reviews and whatnot. I do animation, I do other things, I do animation reviews. I don't do animation. I'm not skilled enough to do animation, but I talk about TV shows and movies and whatnot. So I hope that you'll stick around for that. And I thank you very much for watching. And that's about it. So, with all that being said, I hope you have a lovely day.